Hello, Senator. This coming week, there's a very important hearing on the total overhaul of the way in which pharmaceutical companies price their prescription drugs in the American market. Having this position thrust upon you on such short notice can be overwhelming, so we have organized a quick debriefing presented by experts in the field to aptly prepare you for your hearing.
We'll start by introducing the term corporation. What is it? Why do they exist? How are corporations structured under US law? And should pharmaceutical companies be incorporated? So, what is a corporation? Corporations are comprised of a group of individuals that have the common incentive to obtain as much profit as possible for their shareholders, even if this comes at the expense of others. So, how did corporations come about? Corporations used to exist for simpler reasons, such as a group of people being granted government charters to build a bridge or fix a road. But they have progressed into much more powerful entities since then. This is mostly due to the Civil War and Industrial Revolution. Under US law, corporations are a separate legal entity from the shareholders. This was made possible mostly by the misconstruction of the 14th Amendment. This amendment was to free the slaves and essentially says that no state can deprive any person the right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Corporations took advantage of this amendment, arguing that corporations are made up of people and therefore should have the same rights as a single person.
Corporations have limited liability protection. This means that if anything were to happen, each person who invested in the company is only responsible for the amount they each put in. For example, if 10 people get together and put $100 into a corporation and a worker slips, falls, and sues the company 10 years later, when it is a multi-million-dollar company, the company is still only responsible for paying $100 to each person, and their losses can never exceed the amount that they have invested. Should pharmaceutical companies be incorporated? Incorporating pharmaceutical companies would give them too much power. Corporations rarely face any consequences because they bring in such a large sum of money and are able to pay their way out of their situations. They have a hold on our government through money talks and politicians who also take our money. So DC is pretty corrupt. Now that we have a basic understanding of how corporations are laid out, hopefully you can start painting your own personal picture of big pharmaceutical companies.
We will now be discussing the FDA and answering the following questions. What is it? How are drugs approved in the United States? Are there any issues with the FDA that the senator should be aware of? Should drugs be approved after phase 2? And who is liable if the FDA makes a mistake? What is the FDA? Simplistically, the FDA stands for the US Food and Drug Administration. What does the FDA do? The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety and security of drugs, biological products, food, and medical devices. The FDA is also responsible for helping speed medical innovations to further advance the medical field so the public has access to more effective and safer products, as well as more reliable information to help improve their health.
Now that you know generally what the FDA is responsible for and know what it stands for, I'm going to walk you through the drug approval process. This infographic here will start us off. There's discovery and development, preclinical research, clinical research, which is composed of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, government review after that research is done with that data, and post-market safety monitoring. So as drugs are put on the market, they can be taken off, they can have label changes. So monitoring the safety even after it's introduced to the public is the last step. Like I said, there's a preclinical phase, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. That's what we will be focusing on. And it's important to note that the FDA itself does not gather data or run trials. They only approve the results that they are actually given. So, like I said, we have the preclinical phase. This is phase, you're just testing the drugs on animals and presumably those with systems that are similar to those in humans. Then we go on to phase 1, and it establishes basic safety for healthy humans, and it's a relatively small trial size. So they will give that drug to healthy humans and just try to establish if it's safe in phase 1. When we get to phase 2, the safety is determined in unhealthy individuals. So these will be individuals that have the disease that the drug is targeting in the first place. This is where you see that infamous drug versus placebo group, and this phase can normally consist of hundreds of individuals. Efficacy is not established until phase 3. So phase 1 and 2 are just establishing safety. Efficacy is established in phase 3. The drug only has to be better than the placebo, which is essentially a sugar pill. As long as the drug is more effective than the sugar pill placebo, you've proved efficacy. And if it's proved safety in the previous phases, then it can be then distributed out to the public. And this phase can be up to thousands of individuals. Issues with the FDA, they don't actually run the trials and gather the data themselves, so they just make decisions based off what they're actually given. They also send out a complete response letter, which indicates exactly in the proposal that they're given from these companies, exactly what caused their drug to be denied and exactly how to fix it. So it is not uncommon for drug companies to make the necessary changes in order to get their drugs approved without actually running any other trials. So the FDA, if they make a mistake, they are not necessarily held liable. They can just put a new label on a drug with appropriate warnings. Like in the Eli Lilly case, they put a warning label for high blood sugar, but it stayed on the market. They can withdraw the drug from the market, but they don't necessarily have to do that. So the FDA has lost a lot of credibility because there's a lot of problems with a lot of drugs that are on the market, and slapping labels on them, is a quick fix, but essentially it's not fixing the entirety of the problem. So I mentioned a little earlier, drug companies take hits. They just take the lawsuits, but they're billion-dollar companies. So as long as they make more money than they could lose, they pretty much just, hey, if we put this drug on the market for 6 months, even if we get lawsuits after, at least we made $1 billion. That's kind of how it works. So drug companies are normally held responsible in the form of lawsuits. So now that you've learned the structure of Big Pharma and how, drugs get prepared and get put onto market, you can learn about how that profit during marketing is actually insured to those companies who made the drug. So this will lead us into our conversation about intellectual property and patent laws.
In this section, we're going to be talking about what is IP, what does it have to do with pharmaceutical companies. With that, it's important to talk about the legal structure that guides issues with IP, and also if there are any ethical issues we should be considering, especially within the United States. So IP is an acronym that stands for intellectual property, and it's essentially defined as any form of novel creativity that comes from human intellect, which is highly unique, and that's created by either an individual person or an organization. So the really important thing to understand with intellectual property is that it must be highly original and it cannot have been previously documented. So when we're thinking about intellectual property rights, they're going to fall into 4 main categories. So you have copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. So the picture on your right side is going to essentially outline a short definition for each of those. So when we're talking about pharmaceutical companies, the really important one to highlight is patents, because those are very common. When a drug is developed, the scientific researchers in the pharmaceutical company are going to file for a patent typically. And what that patent is going to do, because patents by definition protect functional or ornamental features, that patent is going to have some sort of expiration date, typically 20 years. And within those 20 years, that pharmaceutical company only is going to have the right to develop and create that drug and put that drug on the market. And no but other pharmaceutical company can do the same. So it essentially legally excludes other pharmaceutical companies from creating that drug also. Except when the patent expires, the pharmaceutical company must fully disclose how that drug is developed, and it's essentially free range. With trade secrets, it's a little bit different, and some companies might view it as having a competitive edge, but others think it has more cons than pros. So with trade secrets, it's essentially up to you, like the picture says with the Coke formula. No one knows what's in Coca-Cola or how it's made. So as long as the company can keep it a secret, then they have that competitive advantage of being the only company that knows how to make Coca-Cola. So drug companies can do the same. Trademarks are used for brand names typically. So when we think of names like NyQuil or Claritin, those are all trademarked. And different pharmaceutical companies cannot slap that same name on new drugs. Copyrights are not incredibly common with the pharmaceutical industry. They protect works like books, movies, and drawings, like the image states. So if in research and development, for example, of a drug, if the researchers want to, let's say, use a graph from a different company in their lab report when they're doing development, they have to obtain proper permission from the authors of that graph in order to use that. It's important to understand why pharmaceutical companies typically seek patents in comparison to other forms of intellectual property protection. Patents basically give the exclusive right to the pharmaceutical company, at least for a certain amount of time, to be the only ones who are allowed to create and put this drug on the market and sell it. So it provides that competitive advantage for the pharmaceutical company. And also it provides this incentive for pharmaceutical companies to continue to develop these drugs because they aren't constantly worried about other companies stealing their idea, essentially stealing their profit. So this makes patents the most appropriate legal route for their goals. You can see why this would be important to pharmaceutical companies, because in the image on the right, you have two people hard at work in a lab. Research and development of new drugs takes a lot of money, takes a lot of human intellect, just a lot of effort in general. So it's definitely something you want to be careful with sharing how they're manufactured. With that, it's important to discuss that the process of obtaining a patent in general is really time consuming, and it's regulated by a large amount of international and domestic organizations. So this is basically the process we use in the United States to ensure that we're not just patenting things that already exist, because we want to continue to progress as a society, right? So there are IP protection granting organizations that are going to thoroughly review literature and thoroughly review previous patents to make sure that we aren't continuously repeating ourselves. So in the US, we have the United States Patent and Trademark Office in Virginia, which I have an image of the office building on the top of the slide. And essentially, when a pharmaceutical company, for example, or maybe an individual who just filed for a patent on their new invention, if they are approved by this United States Patent and Trademark Office for that patent, they will receive a certificate from the director that looks like it does on the right side of the slide. This essentially just states that their time period of 20 years for drug development is starting. As our new senator, it's obviously very important that you understand the legal structure that guides intellectual property laws. So IP was originally governed by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, and this was then replaced by the World Trade Organization in 1994, also called the WTO, and we have the official logo of the World Trade Organization at the top of the slide, which I would familiarize yourself with. And the WTO essentially oversees international trade. The World Intellectual Property Organization, or the WITO, is a different international organization that we have, and this essentially oversees global intellectual property treaties. So from an international perspective, people wanted to find a way to sort of link the goals of the WTO and the WITO, and this was done through the TRIPS agreement. So the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property, or TRIPS, was an official addition to the World Trade Organization, and it essentially had the intention to establish a more fair and equitable system across the world, especially for things such as medications and access to them. So this didn't really come to fruition as much as people thought it would, because there were so many gaps in different countries as far as like patent protection laws. Some countries had very short patent protections and others had longer ones. So people were not seeing the equity that they were promised. And it's because of this that the Doha Declaration was established in 2001, and this increased accessibility to medications after many developing countries were saying that the TRIPS agreement was not doing enough. Another really important thing with the Doha Declaration is that it established that in times of crisis, the World Trade Organization could issue a compulsory license to drug companies that don't normally have permission to develop a drug because it would be under patent protection from one company. But in times of crisis, when more people are in need, they would then have permission to develop and manufacture that drug.
So why does IP play such a big role in the global pharmaceutical industry? The short answer to this question is because exclusivity is everything. Additionally, it's important to know, and as will be discussed later, that research and development requires significantly more time and money than production does. The process of synthesizing a drug, manufacturing it, as well as selling it in hospitals and stores is much cheaper and less time consuming than the process of identifying active ingredients, studying the interaction between this active ingredient and other molecules, and running the drug through clinical and preclinical trials. This exclusivity that is offered, it's designed to be an incentive to companies to complete this R&D due to such a high cost. They felt that they needed a way to incentivize this. It is intended to benefit the consumer, as the idea is that this research and development will generate drugs that ultimately help people, potentially curing diseases that were previously thought to be uncurable. You'll notice that benefits is in quotations in regards to benefiting the consumer, because as we'll learn a little bit later, the consumer is not ultimately the one that often benefits from these laws. Commonly, it can be the pharmaceutical companies. This slide is a diagram showing the process of drug development all the way from early drug discovery on the left to post-market monitoring on the right. This is an extremely lengthy process with lots of intermediate steps, as can be seen. This is relevant to the idea behind a 20-year patent because the 20 years of patent exclusivity starts the moment that a drug company's patent is approved. As a result, the drug company does not want this extensive process falling in that 20 years because then they'll lose out on time in which they can actually sell the product because they can't sell it during like the preclinical studies or the clinical development, for example. So it turns into this balancing act that drug companies must address, in which they don't want to patent the drug too late because they run the risk of another company coming in and stealing the idea and patenting it before them, and therefore they can't sell it themselves. Or if they patent too early, then too many of these intermediate steps fall into the 20-year patent, and then they have a very limited time in which they can actually exclusively sell the product. And this ends up equating to less money and less profit. There are a number of concerns with intellectual property as it relates to the pharmaceutical industry, the first of which being patent exclusivity. While it is intended to accomplish a goal of rewarding research and development, it does so at the expense of the consumer. This is due to the fact that these practices are monopolistic in nature, as they decrease the level of competition faced by companies that have patents for particular drugs. This leaves the consumer being forced to pay whatever price is set by the company that has patent exclusivity, as there are no other alternatives until the term of the patent runs out. You'll notice I've included a picture of antitrust law on the right-hand side of the screen, and this is to serve as a reminder that the US does have pre-established laws in place intended to prevent monopolies and protect consumers. It is interesting that these laws seemingly do not apply to the pharmaceutical industry in the ways that we've discussed. An additional ethical concern and legal loophole is what's known as evergreening. And what evergreening is it's the creation of Me Too drugs in order to maintain patent rights. A Me Too drug is a version of an existing drug that has been slightly changed or altered, and these changes don't really add any true benefits. So an example of a Me Too drug could be if you slightly changed the way in which the active ingredient is absorbed into the body. This wouldn't really provide any benefit to the consumer. However, it is patentable as a second drug. Companies are able to maintain these patents for much longer than intended by daisy-chaining the patents for Me Too drugs together in order to extend well beyond the 20 years intended by the US Trademark and Patent Office. This actually ends up harming society by stifling innovation, as companies that participate in evergreening are able to be complacent and able to slightly tweak existing drugs while not putting true research and development into drugs that will truly help people, such as drugs that could cure cancer. An example of a drug that is a product of evergreening is ranitidine, which is commonly known as Zantac 75, which you may have taken. As for the prevalence of evergreening, it is extremely common, more common than anybody probably realizes. 74% of drug patents were granted were cases of evergreening from the year 2000 to 2010. 80% of best-selling drugs use this method at least once, and 50% did more than once. So more than likely, a wide variety of the drugs that you know of, and probably have even taken some of them, are the product of evergreening. An extreme example is the cancer drug Revlimid, which is a highly expensive cancer drug, and this company that owns this drug has applied for more than 105 patents for the drug, and many of these have been approved. The company has exclusivity for this drug until the year 2036, which in total will be roughly 40 years of total patent protection, which is double the intention of the law. You'll notice that I've included a picture of evergreen trees on the right-hand side of the screen, as I feel that the term evergreening helps to explain the concept. Evergreen trees are trees that never change from their original green color, and they stay what appears to be alive year-round. This is very true and very relevant to the idea of evergreening, as companies are able to maintain these patents, and they seemingly don't waver, and the profits continue to rake in. An additional ethical concern is the patenting of life, and this really came to the forefront in two very controversial Supreme Court rulings, the first of which is the Association for Molecular Pathology versus Myriad Genetics. And in this case, the patents of cDNA, which is complementary DNA or synthetically made DNA, and two human genes were challenged in the Supreme Court. These three entities, the cDNA and the two human genes, they're used in a diagnostic test for certain cancers, namely ovarian and breast cancer. The Association for Molecular Pathology argued that Myriad Genetics could not own these entities or not patent them as they are living. The controversial ruling was that natural DNA and genes are ineligible for patents, and the justification for this was that it was an isolation versus creation argument. The courts decided that since Myriad Genetics did not create these genes, rather they only isolated them and determined their existence and determined their location on the human genome, this is not creativity, this is not valid for intellectual property. However, they did rule that cDNA is patent eligible due to the fact that it is not naturally occurring. They actually had to apply some creativity and some scientific research in order to generate it, so it can be patented and its exclusivity can be owned. The second case is the John Moore versus the Regents of the University of California. And this was a very interesting case in which John Moore got his spleen removed, and some of the cells from the procedure were used to develop a cell line. What a cell line is it's a culture of cells developed from one additional cell. And in this case, that was Moore's cells. This cell line was used very successfully in a number of therapeutic treatments by the University of California and their physicians. And Moore actually ended up suing the patent holder of the cell line, as he cited that since the cell line was developed from his original cell, that he should own it and that he should also have rights to the profits generated from it. The court ended up ruling in the favor of the patent holders, so the Regents of the University of California, and these are the physicians and researchers that developed and patented Moore's cells. You'll see in the bottom right that there is a diagram of the different levels of human composition from the organism all the way to the DNA double helix. And for example, in the Moore versus Regents of California case, they decided that a cell line, which is derived from a single cell, can be patented and owned. The human body is made up of trillions of cells, and DNA is contained in a double helix, or DNA in the form of a double helix is contained within these cells. Therefore, by owning a cell line that stemmed from Moore's original cell, Moore's DNA is actually patented due to the nature of cellular replication and DNA replication. You can see that there are a lot of ethical concerns with the way that these different concepts and these different entities interconnect, and these will certainly be issues that we will be forced to address in the future as biological technology continues to improve and that genetics continue to come to the forefront of science. Should the US address the issues associated with the patenting of pharmaceuticals? As a group, yes, we argue that ethical concerns and legal loopholes need to be confronted. We feel that the current system no longer meets the needs of the masses, as it is unable to serve its original purpose of incentivizing research and development. Furthermore, we feel that the current system contradicts the free market ideals of the nation as it relates to capitalism and market competition. We also feel that the current system harms citizens medically and financially and fails to address future concerns associated with the patenting of life. You'll notice that I've included a picture of the US Congress in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, and this is to serve as a reminder that the only way to enact change is through legislation. The responsibility lies with elected officials, such as senators like yourself, to serve the needs of their constituents to the best of their ability.
In this last part, we will discuss why drug prices are so high and how much of this money actually goes into research and development for medications. We will also look at what would happen if we were to lower the drug prices and whether our advances in discovery will be put in jeopardy. To be quite frank, drug prices are high because they can be. There is no regulation on the pricing of drugs, and because of what we talked about with the patent laws, there is no competition while drugs are patented, meaning that those drug companies can charge whatever they want because they know that they are the only source available. Drug companies operate under the scope of needing money for research and development, but shockingly, this does not cost nearly as much as we think, and a lot of their profits actually go to marketing or other expenses. And even with this, they pocket much more of the money than they lose or spend. And with current laws, the government can't negotiate with drug companies to lower the prices. It's actually illegal. If you look at this graph, you can see that the US is increasingly spending a lot more on healthcare each year. It also shows that Americans are putting more of what they earn towards healthcare each year, which further emphasizes how expensive healthcare and medications are in the US.
So how much of the profit actually goes to research and development that for drugs that are on the market? So you have to consider the data source. Drug companies have full control of who they give access to for their data. They mostly give them to like economists, consulting firms, and universities. Particularly, a study was done by Tufts University where they crunched the numbers and said research and development costs approximately $802 million for a company. If you think about this, like I said, you have to consider the data source. So if these people are being granted specific and special access, and especially if the companies are pouring money and giving money to these people in universities, it's likely that they are going to take the numbers and make them into something that's going to be a higher value than is actually necessary to make sure these companies get more money for research and development when they might not necessarily even need it or use it for that. When you re-estimate the cost, you see that it's actually around like $403 million. So there's about 399, 400 million left over. So it's like a credit from the stock market if they had invested it. They call it capital cost. So basically, the drug companies get credit for what they did invest. So like they get money, they get the credit for what they actually invested into research and development. They get that return to them. And they also get money for what they would have made had they invested it in the stock market. So Big Pharma itself is rarely even involved in actual research and development. So there's this claim that they need so much for research and development, but when you really look at it, the research and development isn't really being done by Big Pharma and by those companies. They buy the ideas and the drugs pretty much after everything is already set in stone. Like the FDA, like they don't run their own experiments, they don't gather their own data, they just get everything and approve it after everything is kind of already done. So the actual process looks more like a university getting money from the federal government. So this would be taxpayer money. This could even be something like the NIH, anything that does research. And they get funded by the government, taxpayer money. So using the example of university, continuing at that, university will then do the grunt end of the work to develop the drug. So they'll do the research, they do the development, they will run the trials. After it is actually developed is when the idea is sold to Big Pharma. So Big Pharma has had no involvement really up until this point. So it's developed already and just the idea is sold to Big Pharma. Big Pharma will like mass produce and market the drug so that they can sell it to us, and they will sell it to us at inflated prices. So even if it costs them $10 to make, they will sell it to consumers for like $100. Consumers, when they buy this, they're taxed again. And lastly, grant money will be sent to the universities, and this cycle will start again. So grant money, taxpayer money sent to the universities, and this timeline starts again. So only 2% of the profits are really put back into actual research and development that these drug companies get. So most of this other stuff is going to things like marketing and just pocketing the money and giving it to people to influence people, like a lot of political figures and stuff like that. So the idea that lowering prescription drug costs will lead to less money for research and development is really, you can just consider it a tactic used by those companies in order to like scare the public and keep them paying whatever prices the company asks. So it's like, if you guys want drugs and want us to do research and development to help potentially find a cure to cancer, you guys will keep buying the drugs at these prices because, we need this money coming in to do that. Realistically, they don't really need that. Like if they slashed their prices in half and we paid half, they would still make a hefty profit. But so no advances would be put at jeopardy in terms of getting new drugs and innovations out there. So yeah, like I said, they will still make a very large profit after all their expenses. It's just going to be smaller than it already is. And Personally, I just don't think that there is necessarily a reason for drug companies to be billion-dollar corporations. Like, all of that money should be going back to the people. In the UK and in other countries, they let their government negotiate their prices. So once all of that is done, like on this slide, and we get to producing and marketing the drugs, so like this step here, the government can go in another country and say like, hey, like, we'll be willing to do 30 when a drug costs, like, let's say 100. The drug companies can counter and be like, well, 70. And then they might come at a compromise for like $50. Meanwhile, in the US, that is actually illegal. So if the drug companies want 100, 200, 1,000, that's just what the people pay. The government is not allowed to interfere and negotiate prices at all. So I hope this all helps with your hearing. So basically, in a nutshell, Big Pharma, which is just like the name for the big major pharmaceutical companies, they're considered corporations. So that brings us, like, ties on our first point. The drugs are marketed and approved by the FDA. They will honestly put almost anything on the market. In that process, kind of twofold process, you're putting them on the market, but when they're on the market, you're going to want to have a patent for it. So drugs are patented so that one company has full control over manufacturing that drug to maximize profits during the marketing. So like after the FDA approves it, you put that on the market. The companies want to make back as much money as possible. In order to do that, they have to have sole rights to that drug. So they patent the drugs. And then lastly, they're allowed to, because they have the patent, they're the only ones who are making the drugs. So they know they have the freedom, because they are a monopoly at that point, to charge whatever they want. Because like, this is the only drug that'll keep you living for 10 more years. What are you going to do? Just not take it and die? Or are you going to pay for it to save your life? So they know they can do that. So drug prices are just unnecessarily high, because there's nobody stopping those monopolies from forming because of those patents that were explained earlier in the video. Because having how they have those patents, monopolies are allowed to form, and companies can charge whatever they want, since they are the only source of the drug for a period of time. Hope all this helps. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask us. Good luck at your hearing.